Daniel Kim had never liked mirrors, but tonight, as the light from the hallway chandelier spilled through the half-open bedroom door, the reflection staring back at him felt almost foreign. Not because he looked bad. On the contrary, the navy suit fit him perfectly. The silk tie sat in a clean Windsor knot, and the leather shoes held a quiet shine. But because nothing in that mirror belonged to him, it all belonged to her. Across the room, Sophia Choi stood before their full-length mirror like a woman about to step onto a stage she'd rehearsed for all her life. Her emerald dress curved around her shoulders like it had been tailored by moonlight itself. Her hair swept into a glossy chignon that revealed the long, slender line of her neck. She tilted her chin slightly, testing her smile. That carefully engineered expression she used at every gala, every dinner, every networking event where power disguised itself in polite laughter. She wasn't just getting ready for a party. She was putting on her armor. Daniel watched in silence from the edge of the bed, his hands folded loosely in his lap. She hadn't looked at him once since she'd started getting ready. Her reflection, however, received her full devotion, as if the mirror held something worth fighting for, and he simply didn't.
"You're quiet,"
she said finally, still adjusting her diamond earrings. Her voice was calm, detached, the way one might speak to someone holding their coat. "Big night. You'll keep it simple, right?" He almost smiled. There it was. The gentle reminder, the subtle request not to be himself. Keep it simple, in Sophia's language meant, don't draw attention, don't speak too much. Don't make me explain why you're here. "Of course," Daniel said softly. "Simple's what I do best." She nodded, still not looking at him, and smoothed the invisible creases on her dress. 7 years of marriage, and he had learned to translate all her silences. Tonight's silence was the same as every gala's. She needed him to be present but invisible. She needed him to be the shadow that made her light shine brighter. When they stepped out into the cold autumn night, the city below stretched like a sequined ribbon, golden windows blinking against the indigo sky. Their car glided toward the Linden Hill Museum of Science, its great glass dome glowing softly like a lantern in the dark. From afar, it looked like a temple for brilliant minds. Up close, Daniel thought, it looked more like a stage where everyone auditioned for importance. Sophia held his arm, not out of affection, but because it looked good. Her hand was weightless, rehearsed, perfect. She smelled like bergamot and ambition, and he, like a well-trained accessory, kept pace with her steps. Inside the museum, the world burst into crystal light and polished marble. Floating exhibits shimmered between towering columns. DNA helixes suspended in air. Molecular projections spinning like constellations. Waiters glided between guests with silver trays of champagne. The room glittered with polished people in expensive clothes, and everyone spoke in that same quiet, ambitious tone, as if every sentence might open a door to a future promotion. Sophia thrived here. She always had. Within moments of stepping inside, her back straightened, her smile sharpened, and Dr. Sophia Choi, lead researcher of Nexion Biotech, emerged, confident, dazzling, untouchable. The woman Daniel fell in love with had once laughed with him over cheap takeout and mismatched socks. This woman moved through the crowd like she belonged to another world entirely. She leaned toward him briefly, her words soft but precise. "Just stay close. And remember, tonight isn't about us." "It never is," he wanted to say. Instead, he just nodded. They moved together, but not together. She floated toward colleagues, shaking hands with the kind of elegant precision only years of climbing the ladder could teach. He lingered at her side, a quiet echo. When someone finally asked, "And who's this?" Sophia answered without missing a beat. "Oh, this is Daniel," she said with a light laugh, like she was introducing an accessory. "He does something with shipping." Something with shipping. The same line every year. She could have said he ran his own specialized cold chain logistics firm. She could have mentioned the systems he'd built from nothing, or the contracts he'd secured across 3 continents. But she didn't, because his world wasn't part of the story she wanted to tell tonight. Daniel nodded politely at the stranger, smiled on cue, and felt the faint sting of vanishing. The kind that doesn't explode like a slap, but sinks slowly into your ribs like fog seeping into old walls. He wasn't angry. Not yet. Just absent, in the most present way. Sophia laughed lightly at something someone said. The sound used to make his chest warm. Tonight it sounded like applause for a play where he didn't belong. Somewhere between the champagne glasses and the gentle string quartet echoing from the mezzanine, Daniel understood with startling clarity. He was not part of her evening. He was a backdrop. And yet, something in him, quiet, patient, long ignored, stirred. Maybe it was the way the chandelier's reflection fractured across the marble floor like cracked glass. Maybe it was the way her fingers brushed his arm as though touching fine silk, not a human being. Or maybe it was simply that you can only be invisible for so long before something in you decides to stop fading. Tonight was supposed to be Sophia's night, but somewhere beneath the shimmering ceiling of that grand museum, Daniel's story had quietly begun to change. The atrium unspooled like a silk ribbon. White columns, glass vistas, the star-bright hush of chandeliers washed in gold. A quartet murmured something old and forgiving. The melody climbed the staircases and draped itself over portraits of scientists whose names were etched into brass plaques, as if history itself had been invited and handed a flute of champagne. Sophia moved through that light like it recognized her. She was not merely dressed for the evening, she was curated by it. Faces turned toward her with the soft click of admiration. She offered them the version of herself that fit precisely, the one polished until it reflected only what the room wished to see. Daniel walked beside her, his palm warm against the cool line of his glass, wearing a suit that fit as if it had remembered his body since boyhood. Yet he felt strangely weightless, as though he had forgotten to bring along his own gravity. Introductions began like beads on a quiet rosary. This is Dr. Montrose from Regulatory. This is Alina. She leads our oncology pipeline. This is... A pause, a glance that slid toward him and back again. And this is Daniel, Sophia said, sweet as porcelain. He does something with shipping. Something. It fell to the marble with no sound at all, and still he heard it. He smiled, in the practiced way of a man escorting a tired truth. Someone shook his hand as though shaking a coat from a hanger. Conversation circled back to grants, approvals, to headlines waiting to be born. The first time he tried to add a thought, a gentle sentence about temperature variance in last-mile deliveries, Sophia's fingers found his wrist with the airy persuasion of a ribbon, and she laughed at a joke not meant for him. The laughter was lovely, like crystal struck by a spoon, and it shattered his sentence neatly into dust. Her touch was not unkind. It was simply the way you guide a guest away from a room that is not theirs. He fetched her a drink, Chardonnay, pale as straw. On his way to the bar, the museum's exhibits hovered around him like benevolent ghosts. A luminous model of a gene therapy vector, a looping animation of cells knitting a wound closed. He thought of the networks he managed for a living, the cold breath of refrigerated trucks, the red pulse of tracking beacons on his screens, the delicate thread between warehouse and ward where medicine ceased to be theory and became relief. There was a kind of romantic order in it, the choreography of arrivals, the quiet rescue of a shipment arriving within an hour of usefulness. It had always mattered to him that a door opened somewhere because a bottle of something alive had not died en route. The bartender, a young man with freckled cheeks and a tie slightly askew, slid a glass across with the conspiratorial mercy of strangers. "Long night?" he asked, then pretended he had not. Daniel's grateful smile felt like a secret confession. The bartender, ordained by kindness alone, added the smallest extra to the pour and looked away.
When Daniel returned, Sophia was ringed by a constellation of admirers. She did not look up when she took the glass. Her fingers brushed his in a way that might have been fondness if one had never met fondness before. "Thank you," she said to the circle, not to him, and resumed describing a trial protocol in a voice that moved like a fountain. Continuous, clear, self-sustaining. The word "we" populated her sentences. We discovered, we proposed, we published. A collective in which he did not exist, though he stood near enough to hear its heartbeat. He drifted a little and returned, like a tide educated by stone. When a senior clinician mentioned a storage failure that had cost them samples, Daniel felt the old certainty rise, not showy or loud, but clean as a line drawn with a steady hand. "If you overlay ambient temperature forecasts with root density," he began, "you can pre-assign cool-down windows and—" "Darling," Sophia said without looking, "could you find sparkling water? The tall bottles, not the small." It was not a question. She smiled at the clinician, perfect as a stamp. "Where were we?" she asked, and the circle sealed again, his words left outside like weather.
At the water station, he stood still for a moment and looked at his reflection in the crime spigot. It curved him into a stranger, but his eyes were unmistakable. The same patient blue that had watched over late-night dashboards, that had studied patterns until solutions appeared like faint constellations. He remembered a different night, years ago, when Sophia had lain on his shoulder and called his mind beautiful. He had believed her. Perhaps she had believed herself. A server drifted by with canapes, all tiny fields of flavor arranged with tweezers. The young man from the bar passed a wordless glance, a small treaty between men who recognized the seam where a person's worth had been hemmed too tightly. Daniel took one canapé and tasted nothing. Then he took a breath and tasted everything. Rosemary, salt, the minor sweetness of surrender. He returned with sparkling water. Sophia received it without breaking her sentence. "It's all in the discipline of optics," someone said. "Not only in the data, but in the story of the data." Heads nodded. The quartet changed keys, and the room brightened an invisible shade. As the evening unrolled, kindness approached him in scattered, private ways. A spouse asked what he did, and when he told her, she listened with the genuine quiet of someone who has nothing to trade for listening. "That sounds difficult," she said softly, "and important." He could have kissed the hem of her sincerity. "Mostly it's careful," he answered, and wondered when careful had become a lesser virtue. Across the atrium, he watched Sophia accept praise with a grace that was both learned and lonely. When conversation shifted away from her, the smile stayed in place, but something in her eyes tightened like a stitch. He knew that knot, the one tied by fear of being almost enough. It pulled at her subtly, even while the room believed she floated. For a breath, he pitied the performance more than he resented it. Another introduction, then another. He became a soft, recurring note. "This is Daniel." A man complimented his tie and did not wait for an answer. An investor asked about supply chain headlines and, before Daniel could reply, discovered a more valuable leer 2 steps left and sailed away. The evening gathered itself around him and made a quiet, exquisite absence in his shape. He stepped toward the balcony again and stopped at the threshold. You can stand in a doorway so long you forget which room is yours. Through the glass, the city wore its jeweled patience. He touched the cool pane with 2 fingers, like a man greeting the window he once loved, and turned back into the room not because he belonged there, but because he refused to disappear by leaving. Near the suspended helix, Sophia's laughter rose and fell, flawless as rehearsed light. She reached for his arm, as if to display the completeness of her tableau, and he allowed the gesture to rest against him. He felt nothing and everything, the weight of a night balanced on the thinnest wire.
the warmth of a hand that did not know it had grown colder, the steady, human impulse to be seen by the one person who had forgotten how to look. "Stay close," she breathed, eyes on the next greeting, the next opportunity. "Of course," he said, and the words were gentle enough to pass for acquiescence. But somewhere under their gentleness lay a decision as quiet and decisive as a blade sliding into its sheath. Humiliation does not always arrive with crumpets. Often, it is the elegance with which a room declines to notice you. Often, it is the ease with which the person you love uses you as evidence of a life well arranged. Daniel held his posture as if holding a delicate glass. He let the quartet wash over him, let the chandelier scatter small constellations across his cuffs, and inside that borrowed starlight, he felt a tender, insistent shift, not anger yet, not revolt, but the first articulate syllable of self returning to its own mouth. He smiled, and this time the smile belonged to him. The night had lengthened into its elegant rhythm. Glasses chimed softly like distant bells. Laughter rose in well-rehearsed waves. Even the air carried a kind of artificial grace, crisp, perfumed, precisely engineered to suggest a celebration. Yet beneath it all, Daniel felt a subtle tremor, like the quiet shifting of ground before something gives way. He found himself standing at the edge of the mezzanine, where the glass wall curved outward toward the city. Below him, the streets were streaks of gold under the late autumn sky, wind tracing invisible stories through the trees. In here, everything was still. Outside, life moved. Through the glass, the cold pressed lightly against his skin. He let the moment breathe. It wasn't escape, not exactly. More like stepping out of the picture frame to remember what air felt like. Behind him, Sophia's laughter drifted upward. The kind of laugh that photographs well. The kind that doesn't necessarily belong to joy. She was surrounded by a semicircle of faces, the sharp-edged kind that belonged to people who thrived on being noticed. Her hands moved delicately as she spoke, her gestures polished, her tone melodic. Even from here, Daniel could read every detail of the performance. And it was a performance. He had watched her rehearse it for years, in elevators, in mirrors, in the pauses between breaths. But tonight, for the first time, he could see how fragile it really was. There was something in the way her smile trembled a fraction of a second too long after each applause. Something in the way her posture stiffened when no one was speaking to her. A woman who had spent years building herself into an ideal could not allow silence to touch her. Silence, to Sophia, meant slipping out of the narrative. Daniel leaned a shoulder against the cold pane and closed his eyes. He remembered a different evening, a smaller one, a rented rooftop in their 20s, string lights swaying in summer wind. Sophia, barefoot, laughing at something silly he'd said about constellations. No audience, no glass domes, no careful choreography. Just the two of them, uncurated. That woman felt far away now, like a voice from another room. Long night, he opened his eyes. It was the bartender, the young one with freckles, carrying an empty tray and a quiet kind of wisdom. He'd probably seen hundreds of these nights. Polished faces, bright lights, invisible cracks. Daniel gave a soft nod, nothing more. And the bartender, in that gentle way strangers sometimes share unspoken truths, nodded back and disappeared into the hum of the party. Daniel stayed where he was a while longer, tracing patterns in the city lights. When did this start, he wondered. At what point had his marriage become a museum exhibit, something admired from afar, untouched, hollow beneath the gloss? It wasn't that Sophia didn't love him. Once she did. Maybe somewhere, quietly, she still did. But love that needs a stage eventually forgets how to live without applause. He turned back toward the room. From here he could see her as the crowd did. Poised, radiant, untouchable. Her green dress caught the light like a blade catching the sun. She looked like the kind of woman who was impossible to lose. But Daniel, the only one who truly knew her, could see it now. The faint, tremoring wire beneath the smile. A woman desperately afraid of slipping from the pedestal she had built for herself.
And somewhere deep beneath that wire, his own heart tremored too, with something he hadn't wanted to name. Loneliness, yes, but also awakening.
He re-entered the party, and the warmth of the room wrapped around him like expensive fabric. A few people glanced his way out of politeness, but their eyes slid past quickly, seeking someone shinier. Sophia's face brightened when she saw him, not with affection, but with relief, like a stage actress spotting her stagehand in place. Her fingers curled lightly around his arm, the gesture effortless, public.
"You disappeared,"
she whispered without meeting his eyes. "Just needed air," he said. She smiled for the people around them. "Daniel's always so quiet at these things," she added lightly. Another line from the script. The group chuckled in polite harmony. He smiled too because that's what the moment required. But her hand on his arm was colder than the glass wall outside. The conversation swirled. Research milestones, upcoming funding, collaborations that sounded like chess matches in silk. Daniel stood still in the current, listening, breathing. Not quite there, but not gone either. Someone asked him something about logistics, a throwaway courtesy question, and before he could answer, Sophia answered for him, turning it into a joke. The group laughed again. And just like that, he disappeared once more. Except something in him resisted fading this time. Not outwardly. There was no grand gesture, no bitter remark. Just a quiet refusal inside him, small but certain, like a candle that won't go out, no matter how the wind leans. As the minutes stretched, he began to notice things he had ignored for years. The way Sophia's smile faltered when someone else commanded more attention. The way her gaze lingered not on him, but on others. The people she wished would validate her existence. The way her hand tightened on his sleeve when the conversation didn't flow as planned. She wasn't just performing for them. She was performing for herself. Daniel watched her, really watched her, and saw, beneath the gleam, a woman terrified of being ordinary. A woman who once believed she was loved for who she was, and now feared she might only be loved if she kept shining. His throat ached, not from anger, but from a kind of quiet grief. She leaned closer to him as someone else began a speech at the front of the atrium. Applause swelled gently, champagne flutes shimmered, and the whole room tilted toward the stage. But Daniel felt himself drifting backward, inward, to a space she no longer shared with him. They had once stood side by side, equals in their small, imperfect world. Tonight, they stood together, but not side by side. She faced the crowd, he faced her, and they were both alone in different directions. For a moment, he imagined reaching for her hand, not for show, but for himself. He imagined whispering her name and asking if she remembered the rooftop, the string lights, the girl who didn't need applause to laugh. But as he turned to her, he saw her eyes, not on him, but on the faces watching the stage. The moment closed like a door. Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath no one heard. The chandelier above sparkled as if nothing had changed. But something inside him, quiet, certain, alive, had shifted again. Another hairline crack in the porcelain night. The party swayed on, graceful and bright. But under the music, under the laughter, under the flawless curve of Sophia's smile, a quiet fracture widened in the dark. The room altered before anyone said a word. It was not louder or brighter. It simply rearranged itself around a center that had not been there a moment ago. Heads turned in a gentle cascade, like fields bending to a wind. Daniel felt the shift first as a temperature change, then as the polite hush that follows a name spoken in a great many rooms. Victoria Hale entered with the serenity of a well-kept promise. The museum's light found her at once,
the cool gleam along a tailored black dress, the quiet certainty of her step. She greeted the nearest guests without embellishment, her attention a measured pour, no spill, no waste. There was something in her poise that refused pageantry. The atrium, so fond of sparkle, conceded to a different sort of brightness. Sophia saw her and grew an inch taller, chin lifted, shoulders arranged, smile newly fastened. The circle around them dilated. Victoria came forward at a human pace, which somehow felt like the exact pace the evening had been waiting for.
Dr. Choi, she said with warmth that did not perform. Your notes on the beta cohort were elegant, clear where they could have been cluttered. Thank you. It was a compliment made of an honest verb. Sophia colored with pleasure. She answered in polished phrases that sounded delicious and cost something to produce. Then Victoria turned. And you must be Daniel. It was not the usual glide past the spouse. She looked at him, not through him, not around. The attention was clean, without evaluation, like water poured into a glass. I've read the brief on your cold chain pilot with Northcross, she said. The adaptive rerouting in your January storm event. Her eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. That was beautiful work. Daniel, unaccustomed to being called beautiful for anything other than the way he kept quiet, forgot to speak for a heartbeat. It was mostly timing, he managed, then, catching himself, allowed the truth. Timing and humility. Weather doesn't care about our pride. Nor do molecules, Victoria said, the corner of her mouth reflecting a private amusement. When they fail, they do it without drama. We supply the drama. Sophia laughed quickly, as if to repossess the sound. Daniel is very modest, she said, situating herself between them by a measured half-step. He streamlines things. Victoria's gaze returned to Daniel, patient. If you have a moment, she said, I've been thinking about thermal variance on rural last-mile delivery, particularly in regions without steady freezer redundancy. Our models cover the middle, not the edges. The conversation opened like a door on oiled hinges. No one announced its importance, and yet it mattered at once. Daniel described the way he mapped heat like a living current, how he taped forecasts over route density, how he taught drivers to read a sky for what it would be in 3 hours instead of what it was now. He spoke as he always thought, plain, precise, with a quiet love for the moving parts that carried human need to human hands. Victoria listened the way architects listen to load-bearing walls. She did not interrupt. She asked questions that folded into his answers and made them sturdier. What lag time did his sensors accept before alert? How many degrees grace could a vial survive when the coolant failed? Where did redundancy become theater rather than rescue? They talked about battery cruelty in cold weather and the soft tyranny of paperwork that likes its own reflection more than it likes results. They did not raise their voices. And still, the air around them changed measure by measure, as if the quartet below had found a better tempo. Sophia remained in the small orbit of their exchange, glowing, smiling, offering context when none was needed. There was a moment when Daniel said we and meant drivers and dispatchers and warehouse night crews and the sensible men and women who piloted vans through weather with a thermos of coffee and a reason to be careful. And Sophia's fingers tightened on his sleeve, answering a private alarm he did not set off. He lowered his voice. He did not diminish. What did you do when the Western Depot lost grid power? Victoria asked. We failed cleanly, he said. Then we learned to anticipate failure. We staged ice at the midline. We designated quiet churches and quiet schools as emergency transfer stations. We paid for generators we hoped to never touch, and we thanked them when we did. Something softened at the edge of her attention. Thanked the generators, she repeated, as if testing the weight of gratitude in an industrial sentence. That sounds like you. He could not have explained why it felt like a kindness to be told he sounded like himself. It landed in him like a steadying hand. For a breath,
The atrium lost its metallic shimmer. It thinned to a room with people and air.
Sophia's smile held, immaculate. "Victoria," she said sweetly, "I don't want to monopolize you. So many people are hoping to speak with you tonight." "They'll survive," Victoria replied, not unkindly. "This is useful."
Useful. The word set itself gently against Daniel's ribs, as intimate as praise and more believable. He let out a breath that might have been an entire winter.
They turned briefly to regulatory knots, those maddening tangles that occur where caution and habit meet and forget to introduce themselves. Daniel offered a small solution involving shared dashboards and permissions that made auditors feel less like policemen and more like colleagues. Victoria's eyes warmed in approval that did not spill over into flattery. "You trade certainty for transparency," she said. "It suits the work." At some point, a tray appeared. Victoria took a glass only to have something to hold while thinking. Daniel did not touch anything. He had the sensation of a thread, long and fine, being drawn from somewhere behind his heart to somewhere new. A quiet tether toward a conversation that did not erase him to have room for itself. Sophia's laugh rang again. Bright, right, rehearsed. "You've always had a knack for details," she said to Daniel, the compliment framed like a childhood photo. "Charming, non-threatening. It's why this sort of talk delights him." "It delights me," Victoria said, and smiled at Daniel as if he already knew that. "And it saves lives, eventually, in the unphotographed ways that count." Unphotographed ways. The phrase turned a small light on in him. He thought of a rural clinic he would never see, where a nurse would open a cooler at dawn and not throw anything away. Sophia angled her shoulder a fraction, a placement that insisted on ownership without touching the word. "I'm sure Daniel would be thrilled to share more, after the gala. Tonight he promised to keep things simple." She put a gentle pressure on the promise, as one might on the lid of a restive box. Victoria considered Sophia with a look so courteous it could not be argued with. "Of course," she said. Then to Daniel, quietly enough to be private without being hidden. "Will you allow me to send for your notes? The failure modes, the fixes. I'd value a long conversation when we're not wearing rented evenings." He almost laughed. Rented evenings. "I'd like that," he said, and felt the words choose him as much as he chose them. She produced a card, plain white, name and number, no guilt, no humility masquerading as flourish. When she placed it in his hand, it felt less like an invitation than a recognition of work, of thought, of a voice that might have gone on speaking even if no one had come to hear it. He slipped the card into his jacket as if putting away a small winter sun. "Thank you for your time," Victoria said to them both, and to Sophia no less than to him. It mattered that she did that. It made leaving the circle look like a continuation rather than a removal. She moved away at the same measured pace with which she had arrived. The room, relieved to have its center again diffuse, resumed its glimmering talk. Sophia exhaled the tiniest sigh, so expertly hidden it was almost art. "Well," she said brightly, "that was something." "It was," Daniel answered, still calm, still changed. They stood together, polished and correct, the museum's light stippling their cuffs like fallen stars. Around them the atrium breathed its aristocratic air, and the quartet resolved the wandering phrase into something tender. Nothing had technically occurred, no declaration, no scandal. And yet, within Daniel, a quiet axis had tilted toward a truer north, subtle, decisive, irreversible. The party of masks had not ended. It had simply become transparent. Through it, he could see the outline of a different room beginning to form, one where being useful was not a disguise, and being seen was not a permission, but a fact. The terrace breathed a different night. gone were the formal perfumes and curated laughter. Up here, the air smelled faintly of wet stone and pine from planter boxes lining the parapet. The glass dome of the museum softened the city's noise to a hush, and the skyline lay open, like a page with its margins illuminated. Windows lit, streets gilt-threaded, a river turned to ink. Daniel stepped out first, loosening the constraint of his collar with a quiet, guilty relief. The railing was cool beneath his knuckles. Far below, headlights stitched themselves into patient necklaces. For a single, lucid moment, he felt the strange intimacy of being alive among so many other lives, none of whom would ever know his name. "May I join you?" He turned. Victoria stood in the arch of the doorway, the warmer light from inside caught along the edge of her hair and hand. She had set down the evening, no pose, no ceremonial smile. Only the steady presence of a person who had chosen a patch of sky. "Please," he said, and meant it. She came to stand beside him. The wind carried a few stray notes from the quartet below. Up here, the melody sounded braver for its distance. Victoria watched the city, not him, and somehow that made looking at her feel less like intrusion and more like belonging.
"I try to grant myself 5 minutes on a roof," she said, almost conversationally, "at every event that requires a chandelier. A survival ritual? A way to remember the ground is still under the building." A quiet curve warmed her voice. "And that not everything luminous needs an audience." He smiled, the kind that happens in the bones more than the mouth. "Then we're in good company, us and the emergency exits." She laughed softly, and the sound did not glance off him. It landed. For a moment they stood in a companionable silence that felt like a small country set aside from diplomacy. He found himself telling her, not to impress, but to answer the question she hadn't asked. How he'd learned to map weather as if it were a temperament. How drivers sent him photographs of their dashboards at dawn. How the work was a marriage between patience and nerve. "You talk like a person who thanks the generators," she said. "I do," he admitted. "In my head. Sometimes out loud." I suspected. The admission carried no irony. "I like it." The wind lifted a strand of her hair, and she tucked it back absently. She did not ornament the moment. She trusted it. The difference was a balm he had not realized he'd been needing. She reached into a slim pocket and drew out a card, unassuming, weighty stock. "I meant what I said below," she told him, placing it in his palm. "Send me the failures, the honest ones, not the press versions. Let's decide if there's a way to correct the middle by listening to the edges." Her fingers met his for a breath. Nothing dramatic, only the pressure of a professional invitation and the human warmth that travels with it. Yet the contact woke something in him, like a match struck in a cave. "I will," he said. "Good." She leaned her elbows on the rail, considering the districts that lay like constellations beyond the parapet. "I like designing systems that forgive human error without pretending it doesn't exist. Grace built into code," he offered, "and into culture." Her eye caught his, clear as a bell in winter. "Both." He could not have said which part of the evening shifted then. Perhaps no part did. Perhaps he only felt the axis of himself aligned to the quiet offered by a person who saw usefulness as a form of beauty. The card warmed his pocket. The city breathed. He heard the footsteps before he saw her, rapid, precise, a staccato of alarm in high heels. The door swung wide. Cold air and heat arrived together. "Sophia," he began, already knowing the weather had changed. She did not look at him. Her gaze found Victoria's hand, which still rested near his on the railing, and then found their faces. Color rose and fled in the space of a second. The smile she wore for rooms abandoned her. "Get your hand off my husband," she said, and the sentence hit the terrace hard enough to scatter the evening. Victoria did not flinch. She let her hands fall back to her sides, calm as a surgeon setting down a tool. "Dr. Choi," she said, voice even. "We were discussing distribution contingencies." "In the dark?" Sophia demanded, coming forward.
On a roof? With your hand on him. The words trembled and sharpened, an instrument being remade as a weapon. Do you think I'm blind? Behind her, the door had not quite shut. The little seam of light widened, and with it the audience. 2 guests slipping out for air. A server paused with a tray. The glow of phones raised not openly, but not hidden either. The city, uninvited witness, went on glittering. Daniel felt his breath move in measured lines. Soph. No, she said, turning to him at last, her eyes bright with a fear older than outrage. You don't get to make me small for catching what this is. Victoria's gaze did not leave Sophia's face. I will not quarrel on a roof, she said softly. I will not quarrel with you at all. But I won't let you harm yourself with the wrong story. The wrong? Sophia's laugh snapped. You pulled him aside. You what, promise him contracts if he plays along? That's what this is, isn't it? You collect loyalists, and you started with the one thing you thought would hinge me. She looked at Daniel, and the hurt inside the anger was so naked he had to steady his hand on the rail. My husband. Your colleague's husband, Victoria corrected, still gentle, still adamant, and the professional in his own right. She inclined her head toward the soffit above them. There are cameras on this terrace, audio as well. Not to police people, because the museum insures its roofs. If you file a complaint, it will exonerate me and embarrass you. I say that not to threaten, but to warn off a cliff you don't have to step over. Sophia wavered. For a breath, the muscle at her jaw loosened, as if a tight knot had considered untying itself. But the knot held. How convenient, she said. Always the poised warning. Always the perfect out. Victoria's mouth softened with something like sorrow. There is no out here. Only a choice between damage and dignity. Take the one that leaves you whole. The wind rose. A napkin dislodged from a planter and cartwheeled toward the parapet. Someone's phone did not lower. The quartet below changed to a minor key, so tender it felt like the room had guessed the sky. Don't tell me about dignity, Sophia whispered, and the whisper carried farther than any shout. You stripped mine in front of my staff. You made him. She searched for a word that would punish and found none that didn't also wound her. You made him look exceptional. Daniel spoke then, calmly, because calm was the only thing that might not break. Sophia, he said, Victoria didn't take anything from you. She gave something to me. It isn't the same. Sophia's eyes found his and filled. In them he saw the girl on the summer rooftop, the string lights, the uncurated laugh. He saw, too, the long winter of fear she had coddled into law. So I'm the thief, she said softly, as if translating his sentence into a language that hurt more beautifully. No, he answered, and the word was almost tender. You're tired and afraid, and you started living for a room that cannot love you back. The phones caught that. The air caught it and kept it. Sophia swayed, steadied. Rage, when it understands it cannot win, begs to be consoled by spectacle. She lifted her chin. Then I'll file the complaint, she said, as if declaring a new, simpler shape for a world that had gone inconveniently detailed. Against her. Against both of you. If you must, Victoria said, and there was not a ripple in the surface of her voice. I will answer it. It deserves help, not an opponent. Silence bloomed. The server with the tray shifted his weight, not leaving, not intruding. Somewhere below, a burst of applause arrived late and wrong. Sophia's shoulders lowered by a fraction. The anger had burned through to ash, and beneath the ash lay the thing that had ruled her for months. The terror of being ordinary, of finding out that applause was not the same as love. She looked smaller. She looked young. I can't lose everything, she said to no one and to both of them. "You won't," Victoria replied. "Not if you stop this now." For a suspended second, Sophia stood at the edge of two lives. Then she did what frightened people do when they cannot yet choose the better way. She turned and fled the scene she had created, the door catching a corner of her dress as if the night itself had tried gently to hold her back. The terrace exhaled. The phones lowered, some guilty, some hungry. The city accepted the incident without comment and kept glittering. "I'm sorry," Daniel said to the rail more than to Victoria. "Don't be," she answered. "You told the truth without cruelty. That is rarer than we admit." They did not move for a moment. The air came cool and honest into their lungs. Below, the quartet returned to major, as if the party had remembered its assignment. Victoria turned at last, her expression composed, her gaze kind. "Send me the notes," she said, as if returning to the last unbroken thread. "And sleep, if you can." He nodded. She reached for the door and paused, one hand on the brass. "For what it's worth," she added, not looking back, "the room does not love anyone. People do. Choose accordingly." Then she was gone, the door whispering shut behind her like a secret entrusted to a careful friend. Daniel stayed. The card warmed the pocket over his heart, and the wind-deep night pressed its clean, bracing face to his. Somewhere below, applause rose again for something that would be forgotten by morning. Up here, under a sky stitched with cold stars and warmer windows, he understood that forgetting was a luxury he no longer wanted. The elevator carried them down in a hush that felt ceremonial, as if the night had chosen to lower them like fragile glass. Sophia stood with her hands folded, the emerald dress a small constellation gone dark. In the shallow mirror of the doors, Daniel saw two people who matched only by accident. A woman braced against collapse, and a man whose posture had learned a new gentleness for the sake of truth. They said nothing. He did not reach for her hand. She did not offer it. The bell chimed, the doors opened, and the museum released them with the soft indifference of a place that had outlived many evenings. On the drive home, the city passed by like a slow-lit river. Streetlights gave back their rehearsed mercy. Empty bus stops held their cold municipal patience. Sophia's phone, face down in her lap, began its quiet stammer of vibrations. The modern drumbeat of judgment arriving. She didn't look at it. Then she did. And the thin light rose under her chin like a ghost story. "Already?" she whispered. A video. Someone's caption. 100 strangers' certainty rendered in type. A second video from a different angle. The words, "Get your hand off my husband," folded into a headline as neatly as a pocket square. The comments were a wheel that liked its own turning. Sophia scrolled until her breath shortened into small, startled sips. "Don't," Daniel said softly. "There's nothing there for you." "But it's about me," she answered, a child's logic, and kept looking. He kept his eyes on the road, the reliable geometry of lanes, the predictable honesty of red and green. Wind milled quietly at the windows. The heater smelled faintly of dust and winter. It seemed to him that the car had never been so singular a world. 2 seats, 4 doors, a past dividing itself into before and after. Sophia's voice frayed. "They're saying I'm unhinged. That I humiliate people. They don't know me. They don't know anything." Her thumb moved again. "There's a remix," she said with a bleak, incredulous laugh, "of my voice. They turned it into a joke." Daniel heard what she did not say. "I turned myself into a joke, and the world simply agreed." "You made a scene," he said, not unkindly. "You hurt yourself before anyone else could." She flinched. Then, because pride often demands to be the last one to fall, she turned it outward. "She wanted to humiliate me. She planned this. No, he said, and the word arrived like warm water over a burn. Victoria planned contingencies. It's different. The phone vibrated again. Again. Messages from colleagues, from a supervisor, from a friend who had not been a friend for some time. Call me. What happened? Are you okay? HR will reach out. The language of catastrophe with its careful, memorized sympathy. They turned onto their street, where the houses had learned the good manners of privacy. The porch lights were non-committal stars. He parked and turned the engine off. The sudden quiet made the car's own small sounds, the ticking of the cooling machine, the threadbare sigh of vents, seem intimate, human. Sophia stared at the windshield as if it might give instructions. I've worked so hard, she said. I have never been good at being loved for nothing. I've made myself worth loving. You were always worth loving, he said. It came out gently, and for a moment she almost believed him. She faced him at last. Her mascara had kept its promises, but her eyes were wrecked with light. Did you want this? She asked. For me to fall? Is it easier to see me if I'm on the ground? He closed his eyes and opened them. No, I wanted you to see me while you were still standing. The old house greeted them with the particular silence of rooms that remember earlier evenings. He flicked on a lamp. The light pooled at their feet like a small lake, unsure of its boundaries. Sophia set her phone on the console table, and then brought it with her to the kitchen anyway, as if catastrophe were a leash she had to hold, or it might hurt someone else. She phoned first the sensible person, then the powerful person, then, in a moment of quiet despair, the kind person. The outcomes were the same with varying degrees of warmth. We saw. We're sorry. We'll have to talk. Please don't say anything online. HR will schedule time. The words lived somewhere between procedure and pity. She nodded through them. Her nods had always been fluent. When the calls were over, she remained standing by the sink. The faucet reflected them in twin silver fragments. What am I supposed to do? She asked. Stop reading, he said, and sleep. And tomorrow, tell the truth. She looked at him like the suggestion was a cliff. What truth? That you were afraid, he said. That you mistook the room for love. That you hurt yourself trying not to fall. The silence after that was not empty. It was occupied by two lives rearranging furniture inside themselves, trying to make space where none had been offered. Sophia wrapped her arms around her body. I don't know how to be small, she said. You don't have to be small, he replied. Just real. She sat at the kitchen table as if obeying a doctor's order to rest. He made tea with the care of a ritual that asks nothing of the person receiving it. Steam rose like mercy. When he set the cup in front of her, she touched it lightly with her fingertips, as if confirming it would not vanish. Did you mean what you said? She asked after a while, about the room not loving people. I meant it, he said. Rooms can admire. They can adore. But love belongs to people, and people forget how unless they practice. She let the sentence sit. He watched it find its place. Her phone lit up again, pleading with her attention. She turned it face down this time. I don't want to be a story, she murmured. You are one, he answered softly. So am I. So is she. The question is, who gets to tell it from now on? A long time later, after the tea had cooled and the neighbors' lights had given up one by one, she stood. I'll sleep in the guest room, she said, not as punishment, not as theater, but as a person measuring the size of her own noise and choosing to place it farther away. He nodded. Good night, Soph. She paused at the doorway, her hand on the frame as if steadying the house and not herself. Daniel, she said without turning, do you still... He spared her the cruelty of the full question. Yes, he said, but I don't know what to do with it tonight. The boards accepted her footfall down the hall. Doors clicked softly, the domestic punctuation of separation. Daniel remained at the table with the cooling cup and the quiet lamp, the room a still pond in which his face was an imperfect moon. He took out the card in his pocket and set it beside the tea. A small rectangle of possibility, ordinary to the untrained eye. He did not touch his phone. He did not rehearse speeches for a morning that would arrive regardless. He let the night do its slow surgery, removing the splinters of performance, leaving the clean ache of truth. When at last he rose, the house had settled into its old bones. He rinsed the cups, turned off the light, and stood a moment in the undressed darkness. Far away, a siren wrote a brief red sentence no one would remember. He went to the bedroom and lay on top of the covers, hands folded as if in truce. It has a way, the heart, of knowing before the mind will sign. As sleep gathered him in cautious increments, he felt not triumph, not relief, but the strange mercy of a shattered illusion. At least the pieces were honest. At least they reflected what had actually been there all along. Morning arrived, not with drama, but with a clean, steady light. The rain that had threatened through the night never came. Instead, a pale sky hovered over the quiet street, as if the world had exhaled everything it could. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, a mug between his palms, steam curling upward like a question still forming. The house, in its soft way, had returned to its neutral state, walls holding the silence gently, floors creaking only where they remembered footsteps. In the guest room down the hall, Sophia slept, or pretended to. Neither of them had knocked on the other's door. It wasn't a morning for grand speeches. It was a morning for beginnings that had no name yet. He opened his laptop, not for the news, not for the noise, but for the quiet precision of work. Logistics dashboards blinked to life in their familiar blues and grays. Routes curved across maps like veins. Numbers held their own fragile honesty. They didn't need applause. They didn't ask permission. They simply were. For the first time in months, maybe years, Daniel felt the subtle weight of himself return, not as an echo, but as something whole. He traced the movements of trucks across the map, one leaving from Newark, another docking in Baltimore, a pair in transit between rural depots with precious cargo. Real work, built on quiet competence. He didn't think of Sophia then, not of the rooftop, not of the video now churning in invisible circuits around the city. He thought of his team, the drivers who carried medicine into towns where cold mattered as much as time. He thought of the systems he had built, the ones that didn't need anyone's permission to matter. He clicked open a blank message. Victoria Hale. The cursor waited. He typed with care, not haste. Thank you for the conversation last night. I've attached the failure logs from January's storm event, as well as the reroute maps and updated sensor tolerances. We've been building quietly for years. I think we can build something louder, together. He hovered over send. His hand did not shake. 2 days passed. Then 3. The world spun around the rooftop incident with a ferocity that belonged to the age. Sophia's name became a thread of speculation. Commentators who had never met her invented versions of her with careful cruelty. She went to work once, then not again. When the company's formal notice came, an indefinite suspension pending review, it was delivered not with ceremony, but with a cold efficiency she herself had once used on others. Daniel didn't gloat. There was nothing in this that resembled triumph. What settled inside him was quieter than that, like dust finding the exact shape of its rest. On the 4th morning, an email arrived from Victoria. I read your logs. I think you've built something rare. Let's talk Monday. No gala, just work. The words were spare, but they landed in him like a door unlocking. Monday came with its crisp, ordinary clarity. No glittering domes, no string quartets. Just a high-rise office with windows that didn't try to impress anyone. Victoria met him with the same unadorned steadiness she had on the terrace. No preamble, no theater. Just questions, precise and intelligent. They spread the maps on the table, cold chain routes arcing over regions where winter had sharp teeth. He spoke of redundancies and failure modes. She spoke of strategy, scale, and funding corridors. The conversation unfolded with the clean precision of two people who valued the work more than their shadows. Somewhere in that quiet conference room, Daniel realized this was what it felt like to be seen without being performed to. No costumes, no borrowed light, no shrinking. When he left the building hours later, the city air tasted sharper. The traffic was the same. The world had not changed its shape, but he had. He walked not as an accessory, not as someone's echo, but as a man who had found the solid weight of his own name again. Sophia, meanwhile, began moving like someone walking through glass. Her world, so carefully lacquered, had cracked clean through. Colleagues avoided her eyes. Emails carried clipped politeness. The mirror, once her closest ally, now showed a face she didn't quite recognize. There were no apologies between them yet, just the fragile coexistence of two people who had loved one another unevenly and now stood on opposite shores of a river they had made together. One night, she sat in the kitchen, barefoot, her hair undone. The emerald gown was gone. In its place, a sweatshirt she used to wear on weekends when they would talk about nothing for hours. "Daniel," she said, and his name was a tremor in the air. "What happens to us now?" He leaned against the doorway. Not cold, not cruel, just honest. "We stop pretending," he said. "That's the only way anything real can survive." Her eyes glistened, not with the practiced shine of galas, but with something rawer. "I don't know who I am without it," she whispered. "Then maybe," he said gently, "that's what you find next." She didn't answer. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't perform either. Weeks passed. His work grew. The pilot program with Nexion took root, testing small corridors for new distribution protocols. Victoria proved to be everything she seemed: unflinching, strategic, sometimes severe, always fair. She never spoke of the rooftop, and neither did he. Their connection wasn't built on spectacle, but on shared purpose. Sophia spent her days quieter than she ever had. Some nights she disappeared into the guest room without a word. Others, she lingered in the living room with a book she never seemed to finish. Her world was smaller now, but perhaps, he thought, smallness could be a beginning too. He no longer felt the old reflex to shrink when she walked into a room. That, more than anything, told him that the axis of their lives had shifted irreversibly. He wasn't the man in her shadow anymore. Spring came slowly, then all at once. The pilot succeeded beyond expectation. A cluster of rural clinics received medicine faster and cheaper than ever before. Drivers sent him photos of stocked fridges and full shelves. For once, he allowed himself to feel proud. Not the small, hidden pride of someone who builds unseen, but the open, breathing kind. At home, the house remained quiet, not bitter, just honest, like the still air after a storm, heavy, clean, waiting. Daniel stood one evening in the backyard as the wind teased the last petals from the plum tree. The branches shivered under their own lightness. He tilted his face toward the faint stars. It wasn't that the pain had disappeared. It had simply made room for something larger. This was not the story of a man who triumphed over cruelty. It was the story of a man who reclaimed the quiet center of himself, the place no applause could build, and no humiliation could dismantle. And that, he thought as he closed his eyes, was enough. The museum had learned the year by heart. It wore the evening differently now, less like spectacle, more like a promise kept. The glass dome held a milder light, and the chandeliers, though still jeweled, seemed to breathe. Daniel crossed the marble atrium with the quick, unself-conscious step of a man who knew exactly where his weight belonged. The map of the cold chain network he'd helped design pulsed in a quiet animation across a display wall. Not a boast, only a record. People nodded to him by name. Victoria waited near the suspended helix, her dress a matte navy that refused to compete with the room. When she saw him, her smile gathered the stray edges of the night into a single, certain shape. They extended the program in the mountain corridor, she said, low and pleased. No spoilage in 4 months. The drivers will like that, he answered. They measure victory in waste avoided. So do I. She linked her arm through his, professional, poised, and yet there was a softness there that belonged to no boardroom. Come, they want to hear you explain why censors are only as honest as the people who listen to them. He spoke from the small stage without performance, as one might read a letter to a room of friends. He told them that logistics was simply the social life of medicine, that the elegant molecule failed if it could not survive the journey to a wrist, a vein, a breath. He spoke of redundancy that wasn't theater, of dashboards designed to make auditors allies, of the very human art of anticipating where the world would be in 3 hours and meeting it there. The applause felt warm because it wasn't hungry. Later, as donors swirled and executives praised the savings in terms that felt like gratitude in a different currency, Daniel stepped back for air, not to leave the room, only to see it whole. His gaze caught on the balcony where he had once practiced invisibility. The railing shone. The night beyond waited. His phone hummed. A single message bloomed on the screen from a number he had never deleted. I saw the announcement. I hope you're happy. Sophia's words were small in the bright room. He read them once, then again, hearing in them no trap this time, only the ghost of a future that would not be theirs. He typed, I hope you are too. Then he deleted the draft, not in cruelty, but with the mercy of understanding that some doors stay closed because they finally fit their frames. The evening turned toward speeches. Victoria went to the podium, calm, irreproachable, spoke of error budgets and human lives, of the ethics of arrival. When she named his team, people looked at Daniel instead of through him. He felt the ordinary miracle of being credited for work he had actually done. After, they found each other in the seam between crowds. Rooftop? She asked, the word a private corridor. The terrace was as he remembered, but the weather had changed. Warmer air, a moon that appeared to have forgiven everything. Planted pines breathed their sober green, and the city lay generous and legible. They stood where a year ago a life had tipped. I saw her text, Victoria said simply. He nodded. I didn't answer. I didn't think you would. No triumph colored her voice, only a respect for the choices that make a person identifiable to themselves. They leaned on the railing like conspirators in an honest crime. Below, headlights drew diacritics on the avenues. Do you ever miss the old life? She asked, not to tempt regret, but to measure the size of the present. No, he said, and smiled at the plainness of it. I miss the rooftop lights from our first small apartment. The laugh that didn't need an audience. But I don't miss the room we tried to be loved by. Good. She let the word settle. We kept the work clean this year, a glance, wry and warm. Mostly. Mostly, he echoed, and their laughter joined in the air like matched notes. A door opened behind them. Softer footsteps now, careful in a way that asked permission of the night. Daniel turned. Sophia stood just beyond the threshold, bare-shouldered, in a simple dress whose only ambition was to be worn. The year had tempered her, the hard shine of certainty gone, the face gentler from having wept. I won't stay, she said, eyes moving between them and finding no safe surface. I came to congratulate the work. She faltered on the word, then held it. I've started over. A small lab, cold mornings, patients I can name. It's quieter. He nodded. I'm glad. She accepted that without argument. You were right about the room, she said. It never loved me back. A beat. I hope you're loved in the ways that count.
I am, he said, and the truth of it fit his chest without stretching. Sophia offered a small, almost shy smile. To Victoria she added,
Thank you for not letting me make you into the villain of my fear. It was a rare sentence, unborrowed, expensive. Victoria bowed her head as if receiving a medal and a confession at once. No one reached for anyone. No forgiveness was staged. The air did not applaud. And yet something dignified happened, as clean as a table finally cleared of a meal no one could digest. Sophia went back inside, swallowing her shape from the cool light. The door closed with a courtesy that felt like grace. For a long moment, Daniel and Victoria regarded the place where she'd stood, not in mourning, not in victory, but with the ordinary respect we owe to the versions of ourselves we survived. Tell me, Victoria said at last, a smile igniting at the edges. If we extend the mountain corridor to the delta, do the batteries still fail where the damp is worst?
They do, he said, grateful for the pivot that was nothing of a pivot at all.
But we've trained the failure to announce itself politely. We're learning to love the edges first.
Ah, she said,
as all good systems and lives must. They fell into talk, the kind that carried them, unhurried, across the city's sentence. Somewhere between the batteries and the auditors, her hand found his in the manner of a decision already made and well kept. No audience, no proof required, only the warmth of two people whose definitions of dignity had learned to rhyme.
Below, a siren sketched a brief red accent through a paragraph of lights, then softened to silence. The gala murmured on. The terrace held its patient altitude.
Daniel looked out at the avenues that had once made him feel small and now looked appropriately scaled. He thought of trucks at dawn, of nurses opening coolers to find that the day would not be wasted, of lives smoothed by work no camera could love. He thought, with a steadiness that did not surprise him anymore, of the man he had been and the one who had returned.
Happy? Victoria asked, not as a test, but as one asks a truth they already know.
Happy, he said. The word did not gild anything. It lit it from within. They remained like that, hands joined, gaze forward, while the city made its slow, enormous music. No vows were spoken, but something vaster than vows held. The promise to labor in the unphotographed places, the promise to be seen without being staged, the promise, most private of all, to choose people over rooms. When they went back inside, the museum received them as if it had always expected this version of the night. People turned, voices reached, plans swelled. Daniel answered what needed answering, declined what should be declined, and carried the rest lightly. At the foot of the mezzanine, a child, visiting with her mother, pointed up at the spinning helix and said, with frank delight, "It looks like it's dancing." He smiled at that, at the accuracy disguised as awe. Molecule, or marriage, or map. The good ones move. Before the speeches resumed, he leaned toward Victoria. Rooftops, he said, should be policy. Consider it adopted, she replied, and the evening, satisfied at last with its own honest arc, surrendered itself to tomorrow. Thank you for journeying with Daniel through the shadows, the crack, and the climb back into light. If this finale moved you, if you've ever rebuilt yourself quietly and found it beautiful, leave a thought below and share it with someone who might need it tonight. Tap like to help the story find more hearts. And follow for forthcoming tales about love, work, and the unphotographed ways we become ourselves.